I felt the words form in my mouth the way a bruise forms under skin. Slow at first, then all at once. Tender before it even showed. There was a moment. There is always a moment when you can still step forward and change the shape of what's coming. It isn't dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It just arrives quietly, like a door left slightly open, and you either put your hand on it, or you let it swing shut on its own. I kept telling myself I was waiting for the right time. I kept telling myself that if I spoke too early, I'd be dismissed. If I spoke too late, I'd be blamed. If I spoke at all, I'd become the kind of problem that gets solved quickly and without witnesses. Around me, everything continued as if nothing was wrong. That was the worst part. The ordinary movements, the steady rhythm of breath and paper and boots and metal. Men adjusting straps, checking numbers, smoothing creases, passing messages from one hand to another like it was any other day, and not the beginning of something that already felt rotten in my gut. I watched mouths open and close. I watched the way people nodded at things they didn't fully understand, because the act of nodding kept you safe. It kept you included. It kept you from being the only one in the room whose face betrayed what his mind was screaming. I tried to make my worry sound reasonable inside my own head. I tried to break it down into smaller parts, pieces I could swallow without choking. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I was tired. Maybe I was imagining patterns that weren't there. Maybe the discomfort in my chest wasn't instinct but cowardice wearing a smarter mask. But it wasn't vague fear. It had a shape. It had edges. It had the sharp clarity of something you can't unknow once you've seen it. There are truths that don't arrive as sentences. They arrive as sensations. A pressure behind the eyes. A weight in the throat. A coldness in the hands even when the room is warm. A feeling that you're standing beside a track and you can hear the train coming, even if no one else is listening. I looked for someone else to say it first. Not because I wanted the truth spoken, because I wanted it spoken by anyone but me. I told myself that if it mattered, someone higher would catch it. Someone more important. Someone with the authority to change things without paying the same price. And for a while, that lie almost worked. Because you can always find reasons to stay quiet when quietness is rewarded, when silence is mistaken for discipline, when uncertainty is treated like infection. I could feel my pulse in my tongue. I could feel the sentence sitting there, heavy and ready, pressing against my teeth like it wanted out. All it would have taken was a single interruption, a single clearing of the throat, a single phrase spoken in the wrong direction. I kept picturing the turn of heads, the pause, the eyes narrowing, not in curiosity but in calculation. The quick decision made about what to do with the man who raised his voice when he wasn't asked to. And in that brief imagined future, I felt myself shrink. Not physically, something inside, something that had once believed it mattered what I thought. I swallowed the words. I pressed my lips together until they hurt. I let the moment pass. When the door finally swung shut, I didn't reach for it. I stayed where, silent, like I had already chosen to. By the time the days began to blur together, the structure around us felt less like organization and more like gravity. Constant, invisible, impossible to argue with. Orders moved downward the way cold air sinks. You didn't question gravity. You adjusted your posture and learned how to stand under it. There was a rhythm to everything. Wake, wait, listen. Carry messages you didn't write to places you didn't choose. Observe conversations you weren't meant to join. Learn which faces tightened when certain names were mentioned, and which ones never changed at all. Authority didn't need to raise its voice. It lived in the pauses between sentences, in the way rooms fell quiet when certain figures, in the subtle correction of posture that happened without instruction. I was close enough to hear things before they were polished. Close enough to see uncertainty before it was pressed flat and labeled confident, but not close enough to alter their direction. That distance mattered. It was the space where responsibility thinned into obedience. No one ever said, "Do not speak." That would have been too obvious. Instead, you learned it the way you learned to avoid a hot surface, by watching what happened to others who touched it. A reassignment that made no sense. A reputation quietly folded and put away. A man who stopped being asked for his opinion and pretended not to notice. We were surrounded by systems designed to make speech unnecessary. Forms for everything. Procedures for every deviation. A belief that if something were truly wrong, it would already be accounted for somewhere higher up the chain. That belief was comforting. It allowed you to treat doubt as a personal flaw instead of a warning. I watched how decisions were framed, not as choices, but as inevitabilities. Language did most of the work. Words like standard, approved, expected. Once something was wrapped in those terms, it stopped feeling fragile. It stopped feeling like it could still be undone. I was never asked what I thought. That omission was deliberate. My role was to observe, to relay, to make sure nothing fell outside the margins already drawn. And yet, The more closely I followed those margins, the clearer it became where they bent, where assumptions stacked on top of one another until they formed something tall and unstable. There were moments when the atmosphere shifted, brief, almost imperceptible changes in tone, a hesitation before a signature, a glance exchanged and quickly broken. Those moments never lasted. They were smoothed over by routine, by the steady insistence that hesitation was inefficient. Fear didn't announce itself either. It was practical. It asked reasonable questions. What would change if you spoke? Who would listen? What would happen to you afterward? It reminded you that survival often depended less on being right than on being quiet at the correct times. I learned how easily authority absorbs doubt and rebrands it as weakness, how concern can be reframed as lack of commitment, how silence, on the other hand, can be mistaken for strength. So I stood where I was meant to stand. I listened. I nodded when others nodded. I felt the pressure build without visible cause, like air sealed inside a vessel already marked secure. Nothing had happened yet, nothing official, nothing that could be pointed to and named as a mistake. And that was precisely what made speaking feel dangerous. Because once you speak before the damage is visible, you are no longer reacting, you are accusing. And accusations do not travel downward. The longer I held it in, the more it began to feel like a test I was failing quietly. Not a test of intelligence or competence, but of nerve, of whether I could live with myself while watching something take shape that I already recognized as wrong. Not illegal, not chaotic, not obviously broken, but wrong in a way that settles deep and refuses to. I replayed the same thought again and again, turning it slightly each time, hoping it would look different from another angle. Maybe the risk wasn't as severe as it felt. Maybe my perspective was distorted by proximity, by fatigue, by the simple arrogance of believing I saw something others did not. Doubt is persuasive when it speaks in a calm voice. There were moments, brief, sharp ones, when the words surged upward so suddenly that I almost startled myself. A pause in conversation, a question left hanging just long enough to invite an answer, a silence that felt like an opening. Each time, my body reacted before my mind could catch up, a tightening in the chest, a heat behind the ears. The instinctive calculation of distance. How many people were listening? How many weren't? Who might remember? I imagined what my voice would sound like if I spoke. Too careful maybe, or too abrupt. I imagined the expressions on the faces around me, the flicker of irritation, the polite patience that precedes dismissal, the subtle shift from colleague to liability. I told myself that if I were certain, truly certain, I would speak. That hesitation itself was proof that I didn't know enough. This reasoning became a shelter I returned to often. It allowed me to frame silence as restraint, not fear. But certainty is rare in situations like this. That's what makes them dangerous. You don't get alarms or signals. You get impressions, patterns, small inconsistencies that align too neatly to ignore, but never loudly enough to demand action. At night, when the noise receded and there was nothing left to distract me, the thought came back heavier, less abstract. I stopped thinking about what would happen to me if I spoke and started thinking about what might happen if I didn't. That was when it became unbearable. Because the consequences I imagined weren't dramatic. They were quiet, gradual. They unfolded in my mind as reports written in neutral language, as absences where people used to be, as questions asked too late to matter. I tried to prepare sentences in advance, phrases that sounded measured, responsible, loyal even. I practiced them silently, stripping away anything that could be interpreted as defiance. But every version felt inadequate, too soft to matter, or too sharp to survive. And beneath all of it was the unspoken truth I refused to name. Once spoken, words cannot be retrieved. They create records. They change how you are seen. They turn you into something fixed. I watched others more closely, searching for signs that I wasn't alone in my concern. A shared look, a delayed response. Anything. Sometimes I thought I found it. Sometimes I convinced myself I had imagined it because the alternative, that others saw it too and chose the same silence, felt worse. Fear doesn't always feel like panic. Sometimes it feels like logic doing its job too well. It lines up risks and probabilities and arrives at conclusions that sound responsible and reasonable. It whispers that timing matters, that hierarchy exists for a reason, that disruption carries costs you are not equipped to pay. I told myself I would wait for one more confirmation, one more sign, one more moment when the danger would become obvious enough that silence would no longer feel like an option. But waiting has a way of becoming habit. And habit, over time, becomes identity. I could feel that shift beginning, the slow normalization of restraint, the quiet acceptance that my role was to observe, not intervene. Each unspoken warning made the next one harder to voice. The silence grew heavier, not because it was forced, but because it was chosen again and again. And with each choice, the distance between what I knew and what I allowed to be said grew wider, until crossing it felt less like courage and more like betrayal of the person I had already become. It happened without ceremony, no raised voices, no dramatic pause, just a statement delivered with the same measured tone used for everything else, calm, precise, already moving forward before anyone could slow it down. I felt it before I understood it, a tightening in my stomach, a sudden clarity that this was it. Not the beginning, not the end, but the hinge on which everything would turn. The words settled into the room and stayed there. They didn't echo, they didn't invite response. They existed as fact the moment they were spoken, solid and unquestioned, like something already recorded somewhere official and unchangeable. I remember the exact second my body reacted. My breath stalled halfway in, my jaw locked. The sentence I had rehearsed so many times rose up, fully formed, as if it had been waiting for this precise cue. It pressed against my teeth with urgency, no longer abstract, no longer hypothetical. This was the moment I had told myself I was waiting for. The danger was no longer theoretical. The flaw was no longer subtle. The assumptions I had tried to soften were now embedded directly into action. I could see it clearly, how one decision leaned too heavily on certainty that didn't exist, how it ignored the fragile points that would not hold under strain. No one else spoke. That silence was not empty. It was dense, expectant, the kind that forms when hierarchy is doing its work, when everyone present understands instinctively that the time for discussion has already passed. I felt the heat rise in my face, not from anger, but from exposure, as if the room could somehow sense that I was carrying something unspoken, as if remaining silent required effort, a physical act of containment. My hands were still, but my pulse wasn't. It thudded hard enough that I wondered if others could hear it. I kept my eyes forward, afraid that if I looked at anyone directly, the truth might slip out through expression alone. There was a strange sensation in my throat, not pain, not exactly fear, pressure, like holding back water with a thin barrier, knowing that once it broke, it wouldn't stop. I thought briefly of interruption, not argument, just a pause, a request for clarification, a careful observation framed as assistance rather than objection. It would have taken seconds. But those seconds stretched in my mind, filling with images of consequence, of being remembered not for what I prevented, but for what I disrupted, of becoming the person whose name was attached to delay, complication, lack of confidence. The order continued, unfolding with calm inevitability. Details were acknowledged, movements confirmed. The machinery of compliance engaged smoothly without friction. Each word spoken by someone else pushed mine further back. I realized then that silence is not passive. It requires participation. It asks you to agree, not verbally, but through absence, through stillness, through the refusal to act. My mouth opened slightly, not enough to speak, just enough to remind me that I still could. And then I closed it. The sensation was immediate and final, a tightness spreading through my chest, as if something inside had collapsed inward. The relief I expected didn't come. What came instead was a hollow calm, the kind that follows a decision you know you won't revisit. The moment passed. Conversation moved on. Chairs shifted. Papers were gathered. The room exhaled as if something had been resolved. No one looked at me. No one needed to. Because the choice had already been made, not by the words that were spoken, but by the one that wasn't. And in that silence, I understood that whatever followed, I would carry this exact instant with the point where speaking was still possible, and I chose not to. The confirmation didn't arrive all at once. It never does. It came in fragments, spaced far enough apart that each one could be dismissed on its own. A delay explained away by logistics. A report softened by language. An absence that required no announcement because it fit neatly into expectation. I recognized the pattern immediately. That was the cruelty of it. The shape of what was happening matched too closely with what I had feared in silence. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but enough that the resemblance made my stomach tighten each time another piece slid into place. Around me, people adjusted. That was their strength, and their weakness. Procedures adapted, timelines shifted, words were revised to accommodate reality without ever naming it. Nothing was described as failure. It was framed as complication, resistance, unforeseen variables. I listened to these explanations with a focus that bordered on fixation. Every phrase was weighed against the thought I had swallowed earlier. Every justification felt like a translation of the warning I never gave, flattened, sanitized, rendered harmless now that it could no longer change anything. I told myself, briefly, that this meant my silence hadn't mattered, that the outcome would have unfolded the same way regardless, that the system was too large, the momentum too strong, for a single voice to have altered its course. That comfort didn't last, because alongside the official language, there were signs that didn't make it into reports, pauses that stretched too long, eyes that avoided certain corners of the room, a subtle shift in how questions were asked, more carefully, more defensively, as if everyone sensed that something had gone wrong, but no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it. I watched people search for reasons that didn't involve choice. Weather, timing, miscommunication, anything external, anything that preserved the illusion that the plan itself had been sound. And every time I heard those explanations, I felt the unspoken sentence tighten its grip on me. I began to measure time differently, not by days or hours, but by moments of recognition. Each time I saw the consequence align with the fear I had named only to myself, it felt like a quiet verdict being delivered again and again. There was no explosion, no single event that forced reckoning, just accumulation, the slow stacking of outcomes that made denial harder, without ever making responsibility clear. I noticed changes in myself too, how I listened more than I spoke, how my silence became heavier, no longer neutral. It wasn't restraint anymore, it was something closer to complicity, though I avoided that word even in my own mind. I avoided certain paths through the routine, certain conversations, not out of guilt but out of recognition. I could see now how easily the truth could have entered the room before it hardened into consequence, how little space it would have required. Instead, it lingered inside me, useless. There were moments when I imagined an alternate version of events, not heroic, not triumphant, just altered, slightly. A pause inserted, a question raised, enough to slow things down, enough to force reconsideration. Those imagined versions were unbearable not because they promised success, but because they reminded me that uncertainty alone would have been an improvement. What unfolded instead felt inevitable only in retrospect. At the time, it was simply happening, and everyone, including me, was adapting to it. I watched the realization spread quietly through the structure, not as admission, but as fatigue, as the subtle lowering of expectation, as the unspoken understanding that something had been lost that would not be recovered. No one said it out loud. There was no need. The cost of silence doesn't announce itself. It settles, and once it does, it becomes part of the environment, something everyone learns to live with, even the ones who knew it didn't have to be this way. Time has a way of stripping events of their urgency while sharpening their edges. Years pass. Routines replace one another. New structures are built on top of old ones. On the surface, everything appears to move forward, but some moments don't fade. They don't soften. They don't become stories you tell with distance. They remain intact, preserved in the exact shape they had when they first occurred. That moment is still with me, not as an image, but as a sensation. The same pressure in the chest, the same tightness in the throat, the same awareness of words held back at the precise second they would have mattered most. Memory doesn't replay it the way it happened. It replays it the way it could have happened, over and over, with small variations that change nothing except the weight they leave behind. I remember the room more clearly than anything else. Not its layout, not its details, but its stillness. The way everything paused just long enough for choice to exist. That pause feels endless now. It feels like a lifetime compressed into a breath I never finished taking. I've learned that guilt doesn't always arrive as accusation. Sometimes it arrives as persistence, as the refusal of a thought to loosen its grip no matter how much time passes, as the quiet certainty that something essential was surrendered and cannot be reclaimed. There were moments long after when I tried to justify myself. Not aloud, not even consciously, just small internal adjustments meant to dull the sharpness. I told myself I wasn't responsible, that responsibility belonged elsewhere, that I didn't have the authority to change anything. All of that may be true. None of it helps. Because guilt isn't about authority, it's about recognition. And I recognized the danger when recognition still had value. I saw it clearly enough to fear it, clearly enough to rehearse words meant to stop it, clearly enough to stay silent. That is the part that reigns. I sometimes wonder whether anyone else remembers that moment the way I do, whether it left the same mark on others, or whether it passed through them without settling. I've learned not to ask. Questions like that don't lead anywhere useful. They only confirm how alone certain decisions truly are. Silence, I've discovered, does not end when the moment passes. It continues. It adapts. It becomes a companion. It shows up in unrelated rooms, at unexpected times, with no warning. I hear it when conversations drift close to that subject and then veer away. I feel it when I pause before speaking in situations that resemble that one, even faintly. The hesitation is quicker now, more automatic, as if part of me learned its lesson too well. Sometimes I imagine the sound my voice would have made if I had spoken. Not the words, just the sound, the interruption, the disruption of flow. I imagine how small it would have, how easily it could have been absorbed or dismissed. And yet, I return to that imagined sound more often than I return to any justification. Because silence doesn't erase the truth. It only ensures that the truth lives somewhere it can do no good. I have lived with the knowledge that what followed was not a mystery to me, that the shape of it was familiar long before it was acknowledged, that the cost was paid slowly, quietly, by people who never knew a warning had almost been given. There is no lesson here, no resolution, no redemption hidden in reflection, only permanence, the kind that settles into memory and stays. I did not speak when speaking was still possible, and that silence has never stopped answering back.